Hi, I am Sara Schwarzbaum, the founder of Couples Counseling Associates in the Academy for Couples Therapists. Our topic today is when couples fight in session, the 5 essential strategies. I'll get to it in 3 minutes. First, I want to welcome everyone from Chicago, from elsewhere in the U.S., and from the world. I know that there's some people from the Philippines and some people from the UK that are watching. I will talk for about 20 minutes and I'll stay on at the end to answer your questions, which you could write on the chat. If you've been following my work for a while, you know that I believe the world needs effective couples therapists now more than ever. And I also believe that one size does not fit all when it comes to couples therapy. This topic of couples fighting in session is top of mind for many of my students, for people I supervise, and for the members of the Academy for Couples Therapists. I want to remind everyone that if you scroll down on the group content, you'll see many other free videos, free tools, free interventions. There's a myriad of them on the Facebook group. One of the videos that is most relevant for today's presentation is the one I did on May 10th, where I discussed strategies to help couples with emotional regulation. I will not have time to get into that today. The other content that is relevant for this presentation is the tool called Feelings That Precede Behaviors. I posted it again this morning. You can download it for free. So on to the topic of helping couples who fight in or out of session. I'm going to talk about 5 different strategies. The first one is the problem-solving speech. The second one is the what's happening in the brain speech. The third one is 3 questions that I ask. The 3 questions I ask lead me to the 4th one, which is the assessment of the fight pattern. And the 5th one is the write-up of the fighting fair agreement. Like all interventions I teach my supervisees or I demonstrate at the Academy for Couples Therapists, they don't fit all couples, and you have to get couples to buy in to the goals you have for them. In fact, the therapeutic alliance between the therapist and the couple is obviously the most important for change to occur, and one of the most important ingredients of the therapeutic alliance after the empathic attunement is the agreement on what needs to change for change to occur. So if you think the couple needs to stop fighting in session or fight differently, they need to buy in that this is a worthy goal. And here's how I do it. By way of introducing us to the strategies, I want to say that when it comes to fighting in session, there are 2 kinds of couples. The ones who fight in session because they also fight at home, they tend to be high conflict couples. And the ones who fight in session because they don't fight at home and think of the session as the opportunity to air things out, they tend to be conflict avoidant. Now, the high conflict couples and the conflict avoidant couples need different kinds of treatment goals in the first phase of the treatment process. But here are the strategies I use to stop them from fighting that can be useful for both conflict avoidant and high conflict couples. The first strategy is what I call the problem-solving speech, which is what I say to couples when they start fighting in session in the beginning of a treatment process. This is what I say to them very early on. You're not going to be able to solve your grievances and your differences until you can figure out how to talk about them differently. You're each making important points, but neither of you is listening to the point of the other. That's the first part of the speech. The second part of the speech is, during our sessions, if you agree with this goal, we're going to try to do something different from what you've been doing that hasn't worked on your own. At home, I recommend that you avoid talking about your disagreements or your disappointments or your differences, until you figure out how to have a different kind of conversation that goes better, and we will practice that in our sessions. Are you interested in finding new ways of discussing what's important to each of you and get your points across? So, of course, they usually say yes. But they say yes even though they may be disappointed, because some people think that they're coming to a session to problem solve, and what I'm telling them is you're not going to be able to problem solve unless you can talk about it differently. But when they agree, this tends to slow things down a bit. The second thing I do, which is my second strategy, is I talk about what's happening in the brain, and I call this the what's happening in the brain speech. Here's what I say to them. When we feel rejected, criticized, or we cannot get our points across, our brain gets flooded, and when it gets flooded, it goes into lockdown. So when we respond by either trying to dominate or trying to disengage, we're trying to protect ourselves from pain. And we're not even conscious of the survival strategies that we use to try to protect ourselves. So these strategies that happen in our brain when our brain goes on lockdown were developed a long time ago. And they're fueled by the lower brain system. When we are in lower brain mode, we are not entirely rational, and we're not using our higher brain, which is the seat of rationality and problem solving. Once the brain goes into lockdown, no productive conversation will take place, and it generally takes about 20 minutes for the higher brain to come back online. It takes some people longer and some people less. Do I have your permission to interrupt when I see either of you going into lower brain mode? And so I've had people leave the room, I've had people take a glass of water. I just try to get people to stop doing what they're doing based on our agreement that I have their permission to stop him. So once they agree to these, I continue with the 3 questions. Again, these are questions that I ask very early on when I first meet a couple. I am trying to ask these 3 questions because the answers to those questions will let me know how much trouble this couple is in, so I can design interventions based on their responses. So I'm going to go with the idea that they've answered no to each one of my 3 questions. The first question is, do you know how to stop a conversation that is not going well? They often say no. Do you ever have a second conversation that goes a bit better than the first? Let's assume they're saying no. And the third question is, when you have an important issue to discuss or you have a disagreement, do you set aside a time when you're not hungry, tired, or had too much to drink to have a conversation about those disagreements? Or do you try to do it on the fly the moment you're frustrated? So most people say no to we don't set aside time. Most people say no to we don't have a second conversation, although some people say we do. And most people say no, we don't know how to stop a conversation that's not going well. So I'm going to go with that. So let's say that the couple says no to each 3 of the questions. So if they say no, I move on to the strategy, which is number 4 on my list of strategies that I'm talking about today, of assessment of the fight pattern. And here's how I do it. I want to just improvise a little dialogue that I may have with one member of the couple as I'm trying to assess their fight pattern. So let's say this is a heterosexual couple and I talk with a male first. I want to talk to each of them separately, and I tell them that I'm going to talk to each of them separately, and then I decide which one is going to have a turn first. So let's say I talk to the male first. So I will ask him, so tell me what happens when you fight. So the client might say, when we get into it, things can get pretty nasty. So then I would say, who is nasty, you or her? And the male client might say both. And I might say, so tell me what you do when you get nasty. I'm going to show you a list of words, and you can tell me which ones to check. And so I give him a list of behaviors. I have a very long list of behaviors. This is in the on the Facebook group, Feelings That Precede Behaviors exercise. And let's say that I will pick some of these behaviors now for the purpose of this demonstration. So I will say, I'm going to read you a list of behaviors, and I'd like you to tell me which ones you engage in. So I say, for example, I yell, I call names, I throw things, I get sarcastic, I post on social media, I complain to my mother or to my friends, I say bad things about her family. I forget what we're fighting about, but I continue to fight because one of us must win. I bring up the past. I get so loud that my partner is embarrassed or worried about the neighbors or the children. I involve the children in our fights. So again, my list is very long, but I ask him to identify what behaviors he engages in from that long list. Now, after that, I say, and what feelings trigger that behavior? And I tell him that I have another list, that I have a list of feelings that may trigger the behavior he mentioned earlier. And I'll show him the list, and the list has many feelings. Let's say he says, or he identifies, I feel hurt, I feel lonely, I feel inadequate, what have you. And so I try to make a clear link between the feeling and the behavior that comes after the feeling. So I'll say, okay, so when you feel lonely or disrespected or um, hurt or inadequate, you do whatever he said on the list of behaviors. Like I yell, um, I tell her bad things about her family. And the other thing I want to know is, what is he trying to accomplish with these behaviors? So it should be clear right now that I want to elicit feelings, I want to elicit behaviors that come after the feelings, and I want to elicit the goals of those behaviors. So he might say, I want to be heard. I want to feel respected. I don't want to feel shitty. I don't want to feel inadequate. So he may say a bunch of things like that. So I'm trying to discern the three different ideas, the feeling from the behavior, from the goals for his behavior. And then I say thank you, and I switch to the other partner. So now I'm talking to her, and I do the same thing. I ask about feelings that trigger certain behaviors. I show them the list. I show her the list. And after they both have identified the feelings, the behaviors, and the goals, I ask them what is acceptable to each of them and what is unacceptable of that list of behaviors. And then we have a conversation about what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. So we look at the list. So let's say he identified, like I said in the example, that he says bad things about her family, or that he yells. And I would ask her what's acceptable and what's unacceptable about all these things. So she might say, it's not acceptable for him to say bad things about my family. And he might say, it's not acceptable for her to call me names. And that way we continue to have a conversation about each of the behaviors and try to elicit which one is acceptable for the other partner and which one is not acceptable for the other partner. And then lastly, and this is the fifth strategy, we write it out. I write out, or I have them write out, but generally I write it out, what they've agreed on. So here's a sample agreement. We will decide what the purpose of the conversation is, so we stay focused. Um, Raising our voices is acceptable, but yelling is not. And I've had people who tell me that, and I ask them what the difference is, and they tell me the difference, and so I write it out like that. Calling names and throwing things is not acceptable. Um, Often people say we will not attempt to talk when we've had a few drinks because they say when we have a few drinks things get worse. Or they'll say we will set a timer and a time limit for 15 minutes, after which we will take a break. Others have said we will stop a conversation if it's going downhill by making the peace sign. Or they've said if the partner doesn't stop, I will leave the room, go to the bathroom, and then I'll come back. Or we will use the following words to let each other know when we're flooded. Or it's not acceptable to say bad things about my family. So I clearly separate what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And if one thing is not acceptable for one, then of course that's cannot be part of the list of acceptable things. So that's the last strategy that I wanted to talk about, that I write down what's acceptable and what's not acceptable to them, and I send it to them in an email. And I ask them to sign it. And they agree to it. And then when they come back, we discuss what are the things that they were able to do and what are the things that they were not able to do from the agreement that they made, both in or out of session. So the last thing I'm going to say is that in the first module of the Academy for Couples Therapists, there is a full audio of a first session with a couple that demonstrates some of these strategies. And I also want to remind you again that the feelings that precede behavior list is available as a free download in the group. I posted it this morning. And the Academy for Couples Therapists registration opens on Thursday and runs for 6 days. And if you're interested, you can go to the Academy for Couples Therapists website for more information. But I wanted to close by saying that I've made it my mission. I've worked with couples my entire professional career, and I've made it my mission to pass on some of the things I've learned in terms of what works with couples. And I do this both in offering free content and paid content. And I have a lot of free content. Even on the Academy for Couples Therapists website, there's a lot of free content. There's blogs. There's a free ebook. In this Facebook group, there is a lot of content. If you scroll down, you'll see videos and tools and interventions, as I mentioned in the beginning. Okay, so I've talked for about 15 minutes, and now I'm going to wait for you to send me some questions. I see one already on the chat. One of the questions is, do they leave with the list? And I think I mentioned this. We do the list. Sometimes it takes more than one session to come up with all of what I just said, and we need to work on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Also, once they have the list, it doesn't mean that it's a done deal. They could revise it. They think about it. They come up with some other ideas about what they want to put on the list, and then I send it to them in an email. And I ask them to look at it, or I print it, I put it in my file, and when they come back, I show it to them. And whenever I see them doing something that is not on the list, I will tell them to, I'll either show them the list that they've agreed on, or I ask permission to interrupt them. So that is it. That's the only question that I have so far. I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes and let me take a look at one other thing to see. Okay, so I think I'm going to end this video. I wish everyone a good week, and I hope to see you again soon.